Picture this. You are standing in the shadow of Rome's Palatine Hill, the heart of an empire that commands the known world. Marble columns tower above you, glistening in the torchlight, but the air is thick, not with incense of the gods, but with sweat, perfume, and the sour tang of wine. Behind these walls of carved stone, the Emperor Claudius's young wife, Valeria Messalina, holds court not in the Senate, not in the Forum, but in the hidden chambers where bodies are currency and the bed becomes a battlefield of power. Before diving into these forgotten stories of Rome's forbidden secrets, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And tell me where you're watching from in the comments. It still amazes me that across centuries and continents, we can enter the same chamber of history together. The year is around 47 CE. The Emperor Claudius, awkward, limping, older, more scholar than soldier, occupies the throne of Augustus. Rome, bloated with wealth and conquest, pretends at virtue but drowns in appetite. The poets whisper it, the satirists record it, and the historians sharpen their stylus into knives. The empire, once forged in blood and steel, now trembles in its silken sheets. Messalina is young, barely 20, draped in silk, hair perfumed with saffron. Chroniclers like Juvenal and Tacitus describe her beauty as both irresistible and dangerous. To the public, she is the empress, wife of Claudius, mother of Britannicus. To the palace slaves and senators, she is something else entirely, a mistress of Rome's most forbidden theatre, the bedroom. In Roman society, the body was never private. It was a political instrument. To eat, to drink, to lie with another, all of it had implications of power, class, and divine favor. Anthropologists call this the blurring of sacred and profane. To touch the emperor's wife should have been unthinkable, a profanation punishable by death. But Messalina inverted the rule. She turned her body into a stage where purity and filth collided, and from this collision she created dominion. Suetonius, in his Lives of the Caesars, hints at her nightly hunger. Juvenal mocks her as a woman who, after leaving her imperial husband's bed, would slip into disguises and descend into the brothels of Rome. There, according to the satirist, she would compete with prostitutes, renting a cell under a false name, challenging herself to outlast every harlot in stamina and depravity. The account is almost too lurid to believe, but the horror of it lies not in its exaggeration, but in its meaning. The empress, embodiment of Rome's purity, was immersing herself deliberately in filth. Imagine the scene. The lamplight flickering over damp stone, the reek of sweat and wine, the press of strangers in narrow chambers. Behind one curtain, the Empress of Rome, her jewels stripped away, takes on the role of the lowest woman in the city. Tacitus, though less sensational than Juvenal, confirms her insatiable appetites and her willingness to wield sex as a weapon in politics. Senators were seduced, rivals compromised, allies bound to her through shame. The bedroom, for Messalina, was not about pleasure, it was a dominion of power. In anthropology, we call this the collapse of body and state. The body of the empress was the body of Rome. By desecrating herself, she desecrated the empire, and in the eyes of later moralists, she symbolized the corruption that would rot the empire from within. Yet here is the horror. Claudius remained oblivious. The emperor, older, stammering, absorbed in administrative reforms, allowed his young wife freedom. Perhaps he thought it harmless, perhaps he feared confronting her. But while he drafted laws on grain supply, Messalina drafted her empire in flesh. This is the first layer of our descent, a Rome where the line between sacred purity and profane corruption was deliberately crossed by one of its most powerful women. Her games were not secret whispers. They were public enough that historians recorded them. They were staged spectacles, half hidden but fully known, that turned the empire into a voyeur of its own decay. And in that voyeurism lay the terror. For what begins as rumor will soon swell into scandal, and scandal into downfall. The forbidden Roman bedroom secrets will not remain behind the curtain. They will explode into the politics of empire, costing senators their lives, husbands their honor, and eventually the empress herself, her head. Picture this. The year is 48 CE. Rome, swollen with triumphs abroad and rotting from indulgence within, thrums with rumor. The whispers of Messalina's nocturnal exploits have already slithered through the taverns, through the markets, through the marble corridors of the Senate itself. And yet, within the palace, she grows bolder. The forbidden bedroom secrets are no longer confined to the shadows of brothels. They are spilling directly into the political bloodstream of the empire. Ancient chroniclers describe her as insatiable, but to reduce her to appetite alone is to miss the horror of the design. Tacitus, always cautious with scandal, nonetheless records her calculated entanglements. Suetonius, more salacious, claims she competed with prostitutes in contests of stamina. But beyond exaggeration, there is a grim anthropology. Messalina was weaponizing the very thing Roman society pretended to regulate: sexuality. Rome's laws punished adultery, glorified marital chastity, and claimed that the matrona, the noble wife, was the vessel of civic purity. By overturning this ideal so brazenly, Messalina desecrated not just her own marriage, but the symbolic foundation of Roman morality. The Roman household, the domus, was imagined as a microcosm of the state. The emperor was the father, the pater familias. His wife was meant to be the model of fertility, loyalty, and restraint. Yet inside Claudius's palace, this sacred order was inverted. Messalina turned the domus into a carnival of transgression. Senators who resisted her advances found themselves accused of treason. Knights who yielded to her were rewarded with positions of power. Her bed became a tribunal where careers were made or destroyed. Consider the case of Gaius Silius, a handsome young senator. Tacitus tells us that Messalina did not merely seduce him, she consumed him. Silius was compelled to divorce his wife, to clear space for the empress's domination. It was not love. It was the assertion of hierarchy. The Empress of Rome reduced a senator to a concubine, flaunting the affair in such a way that secrecy evaporated. This was no whispered liaison, it was spectacle. In anthropology, such inversions are read as ritualized chaos. By overturning order, the transgressor gains power by proximity to the forbidden. Messalina thrived in that inversion. Her bedroom became a sacred, profane space, like a temple defiled, where shame became currency and secrecy was impossible. To lie with her was not private, it was political suicide or political rebirth, depending on her whim. Meanwhile, Claudius lingered in a tragic fog of oblivion. Ancient writers portray him as duped, blind to his wife's excesses. Was he truly unaware, or was his silence a calculation? Claudius, who had survived by playing the fool during Caligula's reign, may have thought ignorance the safer mask. To confront Messalina was to confront his own impotence, both literal and political, so he buried himself in edicts, leaving his wife to devour Rome. Juvenal, dripping with venom, imagines her at night, unsated until, defeated, she returns with soiled cheeks, still burning, yet weary. But behind the satire lies a grim reality. Messalina's exploits were not punished because they implicated the emperor himself. To admit them was to admit that the empire's moral center had collapsed inside its own palace. And so Rome watched, scandalized yet paralyzed, as its empress turned vice into governance. The most grotesque spectacle came when Messalina staged what can only be described as a mockery of marriage itself. With Claudius away from Rome, she and Silius went through a wedding ceremony. The sources, from Tacitus to Suetonius, insist this was not rumor but reality, a full rite performed with attendants, witnesses, and feasting. Picture it, the Empress of Rome, still legally married to Claudius, veiled and adorned, standing beside her lover in what should have been a sacred contract of union. It was an act of open blasphemy against the Roman order. The horror here is anthropological as much as political. Marriage in Rome was not merely personal. It was a civic sacred union, binding families, stabilizing the state, reflecting cosmic order. By performing this mock wedding while her emperor husband still lived, Messalina enacted a ritual of chaos. She inverted the most fundamental bond of Roman society, and in doing so, declared that the profane had triumphed over the sacred. The consequences rippled outward, like poison in water. Senators whispered of treason. Praetorian guards, tasked with protecting the emperor, wondered whom they truly served. Claudius's advisors, led by the freedman Narcissus, began to see Messalina not as a scandal, but as a mortal threat to imperial survival. The empress had crossed from private debauchery into open usurpation. Imagine the palace. marble floors reflecting torchlight, statues of Augustus looming in judgment, and in those halls, whispers growing louder. The Empress had made her bed a battlefield, and now the empire itself teetered on its edge. Yet Messalina seemed untouchable. Her youth, her beauty, her audacity, these were her armor. Rome had seen corrupt men, gluttonous emperors, cruel tyrants. But a woman, an empress, using sex as both spectacle and sword, this was a new horror. And the chroniclers, disgusted yet fascinated, preserved her story precisely because it shattered every expectation of purity and power. The fall would come soon, and it would be brutal. But in this moment, Messalina stood triumphant, a mistress who had turned Rome into her theatre of profanation. Picture this. It is autumn in Rome, 48 CE. The city thrums with unease. A secret mock wedding between Messalina and Gaius Silius has crossed from rumor to open knowledge. Senators murmur in the Senate House. Praetorians glance nervously at each other, and the marble face of the Emperor Claudius stares out from statues, as if mocking his own ignorance. Rome has seen debauchery before, but this is treason in silk and perfume. Tacitus describes it plainly. Messalina and Silius did not hide their union. They celebrated with feasts, with witnesses, with every outward symbol of legitimate matrimony. To those watching, it looked less like adultery and more like a coup. If the Empress could wed another man in full view of Rome, what prevented her from seizing the empire itself? The horror here is not only sexual, it is political possession. In Roman anthropology, marriage was a contract that joined families, bloodlines, and legacies. For the Empress to remarry while Claudius still lived was to declare the emperor symbolically dead, his authority erased. In this act, Messalina blurred the line between bedroom intrigue and imperial overthrow. Claudius was away at Ostia, overseeing preparations for a grain shipment. The empire relied on these cargoes to feed its swollen population. While the emperor counted sacks of wheat, his wife crowned herself in forbidden rites. The symbolism was clear to Rome's elite. The emperor tended to grain while his empress tended to the throne. Narcissus, Claudius's freedman and closest advisor, moved quickly. Chroniclers describe him as shrewd, pragmatic, ruthless. He knew that delay meant collapse. If Messalina's marriage stood unchallenged, the empire would splinter into competing loyalties. He summoned the Praetorian Guard, those hardened men who held the empire in their spears. With them at his side, Narcissus set out to wake Claudius to the nightmare. Imagine the scene. Claudius, weary and half-deaf, reclines at a seaside villa. Narcissus leans close, voice sharp. Messalina has married Silius. At first, the emperor refuses to believe it. His face clouds with confusion, stammering questions. Could his wife, the mother of his children, truly have mocked him in this way? But Narcissus presses harder. The guards confirm it. Witnesses confirm it. The mockery is no whisper but a public spectacle. Claudius, stunned, finally allows the truth to pierce him. Rome trembles in the pause that follows. Messalina, sensing danger, flees back to the palace. Ancient writers tell us she tried everything: panic, persuasion, promises. She sent letters. She dispatched messengers. She begged for a chance to see Claudius in person. She claimed the marriage was a joke, a ritual, a harmless diversion. But the emperor's advisors blocked her at every turn. Tacitus paints her as frantic, rushing barefoot through the gardens, disheveled, crying out for her husband's ear. Senators avoided her eyes. Servants scattered before her. The empress who once ruled Rome's desires now found herself locked outside the very gates of power she had corrupted. Anthropologically, this is the collapse of the sacred profane theatre she had built. Once her body was her weapon, her bed, her throne. Now both had become evidence of treason. The sacred mask was torn away, leaving only the profane. Where once she commanded loyalty through pleasure and fear, she now provoked disgust and terror. Claudius, pressured by Narcissus and others, convened a council. What should be done with the empress? Many feared that his habitual softness would prevail, that he would forgive her as he had forgiven past scandals. But Narcissus, seeing hesitation, acted decisively. He ordered her execution before the emperor could change his mind. Messalina fled to the gardens of Lucullus, sprawling estates thick with shade and fountains, once symbols of luxury, now a prison without walls. Here, Tacitus tells us, she awaited judgment. With her were her mother and a few attendants. Her children were kept from her. The empress who once commanded senators now sat trembling among the statues of vanished generals. The executioners arrived centurions in polished armor, ordered not by the Senate, not by the emperor, but by Narcissus himself. The choice was offered: end her own life, or be killed like a criminal. Roman tradition demanded noble suicides. Messalina, once bold in every vice, now faltered. Tacitus describes her paralyzed, unable to lift the dagger, hands shaking. It was the soldier who struck her down, the steel entering her body with brutal finality. Imagine the silence afterward. The gardens of Lucullus heavy with incense and blood, the fountains murmuring over stone, the corpse of Rome's most infamous empress sprawled among roses. A woman who turned the empire's bed into a battlefield, now cold in the dust, her secrets silenced not by scandal but by the sword. Claudius, when informed, showed no visible grief. He ordered her name erased from public records, her statues toppled, her memory condemned. Yet the chroniclers preserved her story. Juvenal mocked her as the insatiable whore of Rome. Tacitus recorded her as a warning of corruption. Suetonius placed her among the catalogue of imperial disgraces. The consequences were immense. Claudius remarried swiftly, choosing Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero. If Messalina embodied the horror of forbidden lust, Agrippina would embody the terror of cold ambition. Rome traded one danger for another, and so the empire staggered forward, its heart forever corrupted by the secrets of its emperors and empresses. This is the lesson. In Rome, the bed was never private. It was the stage upon which empires rose and fell. Messalina turned it into a weapon, and in doing so, ensured her own destruction. Picture this. The gardens of Lucullus lie silent, the fountains murmuring over stone while the body of Messalina cools in the autumn air. The centurions wipe their blades and leave. A few attendants linger, trembling, unsure whether to mourn or to flee. The empress who once wielded desire as a weapon lies discarded like refuse, her name already condemned to oblivion by the order of her husband. But Rome will not forget. Rome never forgets. The next morning, the Senate convenes. Claudius appears pale, exhausted, his eyes blank as marble. He does not speak of Messalina. He does not honor her with last rites. Instead, her statues are dragged from the forums and smashed upon the stones. Her name is carved out from inscriptions. The crime is not adultery, not debauchery, but treason. To marry another man while the emperor yet lived was to symbolically kill the emperor, to mock the sacred bond upon which Rome's political and cosmic order was built. In this way, Messalina's destruction is made official. She is branded not merely shameless, but a usurper. Anthropologists describe this as damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, Rome's ritual erasure of the disgraced. But there is irony here. The very act of erasing ensures remembrance. By scratching her name from stone, Rome immortalizes the scandal. Tacitus, Suetonius, Juvenal, they all preserve her story in ink, ensuring that her corruption survives longer than marble. Claudius, advised now by Narcissus and other freedmen, does not linger in mourning. Within months he remarries, and his choice is catastrophic. Agrippina, the Younger. If Messalina embodied the chaos of forbidden lust, Agrippina embodies the cold steel of ambition. She is the mother of Nero, and she will guide her son onto the throne through poison, manipulation, and blood. Rome, it seems, escapes one nightmare only to summon another. The anthropological horror is this. Rome believed itself eternal because it clothed vice in ritual. The sacred and the profane were never cleanly divided. They were constantly inverted, merged, blurred. Messalina's body became Rome's mirror. In her excesses, the empire confronted its own appetite. The empress in the brothel was the empire itself, gorging on conquest, drowning in indulgence, and yet hungry still. The consequences extended far beyond scandal. Senators, once proud arbiters of state, learned that their survival depended not on law but on bedroom intrigues. The Praetorian Guard discovered that their swords enforced not just politics but the outcomes of passion. Freedmen like Narcissus realized they held more power than generals. The empire shifted, subtly but decisively, away from republican dignity into personal tyranny masked by ritual. Picture the city streets in the months after her fall. Vendors still sell figs and olives, children still play in alleys, legionaries still march in formation, but beneath the normalcy, a shadow lingers. Every whisper of corruption, every rumor of indulgence, is colored by the memory of Messalina. Mothers warn their daughters of her shame. Poets craft verses dripping with venom, yet in the taverns, men recall her with a mixture of disgust and fascination. The forbidden always survives in memory. Messalina's death was not the end of scandal in Rome. It was only the beginning of an imperial tradition, the palace bed as throne, the empress as predator or victim, the empire as voyeur. After her came Agrippina, Domitia, Poppaea, Julia Domna, women remembered not for peace or law, but for their bodies entangled with empire's fate. The line between bedroom and battlefield was permanently erased. And so the story closes with a timeless warning. Civilization does not collapse in one night. It corrodes slowly when sacred vows are mocked, when purity becomes filth, when desire becomes weapon. Rome's marble temples still stood, its legions still marched, its laws still bound the Mediterranean. But within its palaces, the rot spread unseen, whispered, forbidden. The empire that once prided itself on virtue became addicted to spectacle, to scandal, to the profanation of its own ideals. What began as one woman's hunger ended as a mirror held up to humanity itself. We tell ourselves we are beyond such corruption, that our world is safer, purer, wiser. But are we? Power still sleeps in private chambers. Politics still bends to desire. Reputations are still built and destroyed in whispers. Rome's forbidden secrets remind us that the boundary between sacred order and profane chaos is perilously thin, and when it collapses, it is not only an empress who falls, but the empire itself. So the gardens grow silent, the fountains murmur, and Messalina's ghost lingers not in marble, not in statues, not in honor, but in memory. The deadliest mistress of Rome remains with us because she reveals the truth no empire dares admit, that sometimes history is not written by generals or senators, but in the forbidden acts behind closed doors.